hope you will enjoy this story based on a myth from Argentina. Grab a coffee or just sit back and listen to this story tale under the moonlight. Luison. Day 1. The last drop of ink stained the notebook's page as the middle-aged man crossed out another day on the calendar. There was just 1 week left until the date that had been circled, David's 13th birthday. However, there was no smile on the man's face. Instead, a haunting look lingered in his eyes. His wife sat by his side on the bed, her eyes rimmed with tears as they scanned the calendar's page. She turned to look at her husband. "Breakfast ready!" a young boy shouted as he entered the room. The couple jumped from off the bed, startled as they both turned to look at the boy. "We're coming, David," the woman, his mother, replied to him casually, whilst trying to compose herself. "Okay," David answered, looking at his parents with a hint of confusion. He closed the door behind him and ran off, without a care in the world. At the table, everybody ate breakfast in silence. It was eerie to see a family of 7 sons so quiet whilst having a meal together, but that was how David's family was, and had always been since he could remember. Maybe after his 13th birthday things would change, he thought. After eating, all the brothers got their bags and headed towards school. All except one. David stared at them through the discoloured front window of their tiny house. The boys walked and walked until there were nothing more than tiny dots in the horizon. He sighed and looked around the house. There was not much to do. He had never gone to school, had never been allowed to. He never really knew why. Something to do with his allergies, his parents had once told him. But as far as he could remember, he had never experienced any allergies. But he guessed that was because he had never gone to school. His mother took over and taught him how to read and write. In little to no time, he was ahead of his brothers academically. Every afternoon, David would watch as his brothers talked and played with their friends on their walk up the road towards the house back from school. He didn't have any friends. Sometimes the other boys would look at him and frown. He never understood why, but he was used to it by that point. It had always been this way. The neighbours wouldn't talk to him either, not even their kids. Some of them would stare at him as if he was a ghost, while others didn't even look at him at all, as if he wasn't there. It felt like the whole town had something against him. When he was little, he'd ask his parents why. They'd just shake their heads and reply that it was nothing. But if it was nothing, then why weren't his brothers treated the same way? However, David was a resilient child and had eventually grown to enjoy his own company. He learnt how to find excitement in the smallest of things, such as the brown jagged rock that was half buried in the backyard. He had spent all of last year trying to pull it out of its burial site with no luck, but he was resilient. David went to the front yard and gazed at the houses ahead of his. A light breeze collided with his skin and sent shivers down his spine. It was the end of summer, and soon autumn would strike once more. His birthday landed at just the right time, between the intense heat of summer and the beginning months of freezing cold. The rest of the day consisted of his mother teaching him whatever she could. After his lessons, he helped his father tending to the few animals they kept on their land. Eventually, David was left to his own device. He felt pretty content today, but once in a while he wondered what it would be like to be normal. That night, the family had dinner as usual. The candles only intensified the awkwardness of the meal. Nobody spoke a word. David was used to this, but something seemed off about the entire day. Normally, somebody would at least recount something about their day. This time, though, even the rattling of the cutlery was barely audible. Only when Damian, the eldest of the brothers, smiled reassuringly at David did his nerves calm down. This gave him the confidence to be the first one to speak at the table. "My birthday's in a week," he blurted out, much to his family's discomfort. "What presents will I get? Can I get a clue?" His excitement vanished as his family stayed quiet. Damien's smile disappeared, while the rest of his brothers avoided his gaze. The silence felt like a ton of bricks. After a few seconds of agonizing quietness, his father spoke. We haven't bought them yet, but whatever you'd like is fine with us," he said, calmly motioning to his wife as he answered. She nodded, but would not look at David. She kept her head down, motionless, as if she was thinking of something she couldn't say. Suddenly, she got up from her seat and rushed out of the room. David watched her go with his mouth open. Nobody ate after that, and soon enough, all the brothers went to sleep, except David. His mind wandered through the different recollections of the day, of his whole life. He had been treated differently since he could remember, but now it seemed worse. Something deep in his heart told him it was different somehow, but he couldn't figure out why. Day 2. "We can keep him in the woods and tell no one about it," David's mother whispered as tears ran down her cheeks. His father shook his head, keeping his gaze on the wooden ground in their room. "How can we possibly do that and get away with it?" he whispered in frustration. "Damien can help. He's older now," she replied with a hint of hope in her voice. "But that's not his responsibility. We can't force him to give up his whole life for a mistake that's ours, not his." David's dad got up and pointed to his chest. "So you think this is the best solution?" she screamed and pointed at the rifle, which had been placed carefully by the door. She got up from the bed and stormed towards him. "You're a monster! How can you do this to our baby boy?" She slapped his head, but he kept his stare on the ground. Sobbing, she slammed the door open and left. The sun was just starting to rise, and the children stared at their mum as she rushed out of the house. They had heard the muffled, angry voices coming from their parents' room and knew some type of argument had ensued. No one spoke. Later that day, after the boys had left for school and his mother had returned home, David knocked softly on his parents' bedroom door, but no one answered. The only thing he could hear were his mother's faint sobs coming from inside. It was already midday, and if David didn't get any work done, it would be a wasted day. At a certain moment, it dawned on him that his mother wasn't going to come out of the room at all. He turned around and headed to the barn, just outside the house. His father greeted him with a faint smile as he stepped in. His eyes were stained red as if he had been crying. David couldn't understand what was going on. The intrigue was like a red ball forming in his chest, and he had to let it out. It was unbearable. "Father, what's going on?" he asked. "Why is everybody acting so strangely?" "Like what?" "Like you are, and like Mum is." "What about your mother?" "She's crying in her room and won't come out. She was supposed to teach me about how fish breathe today." David's dad thought and thought. David stared at him in silence until he spoke once more. "David, don't worry about classes," he said, crouching down to David's height. "You don't have to study if you don't want to." There was a moment of hesitation before he continued. "In fact, you don't have to study at all this week." He hugged David gently as David's face lit up. "After all, it is your birthday week." "Thanks, Dad," David exclaimed and hugged him back. He spent the rest of the day with his father, who showed him how to help their horse, whom David had named Manny, fix its broken leg. This was better than learning about fish with his mother, David thought happily. Day 3. The morning was uneventful. His mother's soothing voice made David wish it was already nighttime so he could sleep. "David, are you listening?" she asked as he lifted his head from his hands and nodded tiredly. "But Dad said I didn't have to study this week because of my birthday." Well, I want you to, she replied sternly and kept reading. David sighed and put his head in his hand, upset. The door opened and all his brothers came in alongside his father. They were smiling and holding things in their hands. David frowned and got up from the table. What's going on? He asked in confusion. We're giving you your birthday presents. What does it look like? Jose, one of the brothers, exclaimed, smiling. But that many? Why? We just thought you deserved them, little brother, another one of his brothers answered. David was astonished while his brothers placed the gifts on the floor. He opened each one of them in a row as his family watched him with a smile on their faces. He'd never received so many things at the same time, from money to toys, a new ball. The last gift from his father was the best of them all, a puppy. A dog of my own, he shouted and smiled wider than he had ever. I'll teach you how to look after him, his dad said with a smile, and David hugged him tightly. David had never felt like he was part of anything, not in school, not in the town, not even in his own family. But being surrounded by his family today made him feel really good inside for the first time in his life. He didn't feel different anymore. He didn't feel alone. Day 4. His excitement to go hunting couldn't have been bigger. The sun shone the brightest it ever had, and his father and him weren't going to waste a day like this one. Just before he had gone to bed the night before, his father had promised that he would take him hunting the next day. Finally, David was going to learn what all his brothers had already learnt from their dad. Come on, David, don't fall behind, his father yelled as David ran faster after him. Why didn't we hunt during the morning? David asked as he gripped the rifle tightly. Because the animals are too alert at that time. This time of the day is perfect, as they are slowly going back to sleep and can be caught off guard, his father explained. David looked over his shoulder and into the sunset. The sky was full of orange and red colours all over. David had never seen a sunset as intense or as bright. They kept walking until his father placed his arm in front of him, motioning him to be quiet. There's a rabbit over there, he whispered, pointing towards a bush in front of them. Aim like I taught you. Between the bushes, David stared at the small white shape with its head popping through the leaves. The rabbit stared back at David but didn't move. It was as if the rabbit knew David wouldn't shoot him. I can't do it, David yelled and dropped the rifle. His father stared at him in shock. But son, it's not difficult, he exclaimed. You wanted to learn? I did, but I can't do it. I don't want to kill anything, he mumbled, ashamed, looking down at his shoes. The rabbit hopped away and his father sighed. It's okay, son, let's go home. They walked back in silence. The man's eyes had a faraway look, but he didn't utter a single word. He didn't want David to notice the tears welling up. What was the point of making him hunt if he didn't want to? Turning him into a man seemed pointless because David would never grow to be one. Day 5. Pass me the ball, one of the town boys shouted to the other as the whole group played football. David and his brothers got closer to the group and joined the game. David usually never took part in such games, but his brothers had insisted. They passed the ball to each other until one of them kicked the ball forcefully towards David, hitting him in the leg. Ouch! He yelped and grabbed his leg as hard as he could. Hey, why did you do that? Damien asked in annoyance to the boy who had kicked the ball. Don't worry, it was only a mistake, David mumbled and let go of his leg. No, it wasn't, the boy yelled, pointing at David. I don't want to play with a monster like him. He's going to end up killing me or worse, turning me into something horrible. The boy's words hit David like a thunderbolt. He had never been told such a cruel thing before, and it made him both frightened and angry. Why are you saying that? He asked, afraid his voice would break at any moment and he'd burst into tears. Because it's the truth, another boy screamed back. Shut up, Jose replied and grabbed the boy by the shirt. In no time, they were all fighting each other. David turned and headed home. "Wait, stop!" his brothers yelled behind him, but he just kept walking, hoping they wouldn't notice the tears running down his cheeks. Once he got home, his brother Ramon, who had stayed behind, greeted him. His smile vanished, though, when he saw David's tears. "What happened?" he asked, placing a hand on David's shoulder. "Some boy told me I'm a monster," David sobbed and wiped his nose with his shirt. There was a long pause before Ramon spoke again. "Don't you listen to them, David. You're not a monster, you're my brother. You're kind and gentle and a good person." David looked up at his brother and wiped his tears. "You're only saying that because I'm your brother," he mumbled. "No, I'm saying that because it's the truth, and because I've known you since you were this little." Ramon motioned a little heap with his fingers and David laughed. David wiped the rest of his tears away. "Don't worry, brother. Those boys are just idiots." David tried to smile at his brother, but the only thing he could muster was a weak grin. After so much aggression and ignorance he had faced in his life, he felt his spirit getting heavier and heavier by the day. Day 6. His steps took him to the store at the end of the block. David had gone there occasionally in the past, but had always been met with a frown by the shopkeeper. He didn't like going there too much, but today he wanted to buy some treats for his puppy Siri. He opened the door slowly, only to find the place empty. He walked further through the doorway. "Stop right there!" the shopkeeper shouted as if from nowhere. David screamed and cowered away when he realized what the shopkeeper had in his arms: a gun. "I'm not afraid to use it," the scared man said shakily, as he pointed the gun towards David at close range, only a few centimeters away from his face. "What are you doing?" David's father's voice could be heard in the distance. In just a second he was next to the clerk. "Get away from my son!" But his birthday. "It's not today, it's tomorrow, you fool!" A deep silence invaded the shop in that moment. Nothing else could be heard except for the light breeze rustling through leaves outside and David's crying. His father took him back home, ignoring David's pleas for answers as to what the man had just said. Back home, the usual heaviness in the house felt worse than ever. The whole family walked around in silence. A feeling of despair lay in the air. David just didn't understand why. Why was everybody in town so mean to him? Why had everybody turned their backs on him? Had he done something wrong? His parents were outside the house discussing things in private, and the rest of his brothers were in their rooms. David was all alone. He wandered around the house aimlessly until he found himself standing in his parents' room. He was about to turn around to leave when something piqued his interest in the corner of his eye. It was a notebook lying on his parents' bed. He had never seen it before. It was old and tattered, so they had certainly had it for a long time. He approached the bed and gently picked it up. Pages of old newspaper articles fell out of the book onto the floor. David picked them up and scanned the pages. His eyes fell on a page as it caught his attention. It read, "The curse of Luison was thought to be just a legend, a story told to terrify naughty children. However, compelling evidence shows there might be some truth to this myth. It is said that on the night of the 13th year of the 7th son of any couple, the curse of Luison comes to life. The child is doomed to a lifetime of—" "What are you doing?" his father shouted at him. "Who is Luison?" David asked, a feeling of dread creeping down his back. "You shouldn't be reading that." His dad grabbed the papers from his hand angrily. "Who is Luison? Why is everybody being so mean to me?" David screamed, but when he turned around for support, all his brothers, who had rushed out of their rooms on hearing the commotion, stared at him clueless. His mother cried quietly behind her husband. "What's going on?" David mumbled, but nobody gave an answer. He stormed off to his room and stayed there for the night. Crying in his bed, he wondered how everything was connected to him. What had he done wrong? Was anything that he read real? What was the end of that story? He had a million questions but no answers. Soon enough, his mind drifted off to sleep. As he dreamed, he thought he could feel the warm tears of his brothers falling on his face. Day 7. David's eyelids felt heavy as he got up from his bed. It was already midday, and there was not one single sound coming from the house or from outside. The last thing he wanted to do was to face his family. But today was the day. His birthday had arrived. Walking down the stairs, he was greeted by the whole family, who showered him with more presents and gifts of all sorts. He didn't understand where all of this was coming from. His heart was lifted once more, especially when Siri ran to him licking his face. It wagged its tail at David, who greeted the dog with open arms. Both of their innocent eyes locked with each other, and David couldn't have been any happier than he was at that moment. Even after all he had gone through, he was part of his family and would always be. His day was spent alongside his brothers, who played with him until the sun set. "Son, come here," his father called from the barn. David skipped towards his dad, who was waiting for him with a rifle in his hand. "We should go hunting tonight. We'll take Siri. He can help us detect any animals nearby. Don't worry, son, I won't ask you to kill anything." David smiled at his dad and gave him a tight hug. His father took a long look at his son David, and a feeling of love and grief overwhelmed him. "Yeah, let's go," David said excitedly. Just wait for me a few moments and I'll go grab something before we go," his father stuttered, and David nodded. Going back home, the man was greeted by his wife and eldest son. She hugged him tightly and sobbed against his shirt, filling it with tears. Damien stood back, his eyes glassy and his jaw clenched. "I can do it, father. You don't need to do this yourself." Damien tried to argue, but his father stopped him. No, I don't want you to live with that for the rest of your life," the man answered, and hugged his son as tightly as he could before letting him go. "Go be with your brothers." Damien left the room, and his mother looked up at her husband with deep sorrow in her eyes. She gripped his shoulders so tightly he felt they would bleed, but he didn't care. After what he was about to do, after what he needed to do, he wouldn't care about anything of that nature anymore. "Don't let him suffer," she whispered, and he nodded in response. He exited the house and was greeted by David and his dog, who had been waiting for him excitedly. David smiled and placed his dad's rifle on his shoulder as they walked slowly into the darkness of the forest. David, his dad, and Siri. Epilogue. The woman walked slowly into her room and closed the door behind her. With her shaking hands, she picked up the newspaper article and began to read as her tears dropped onto the page. The Curse of Luison was thought to be just a legend, a story told to terrify naughty children. However, compelling evidence show there might be some truth to this myth. It is said that on the night of the 13th year of the 7th son of any couple, the Curse of Luison comes to life. The child is doomed to a lifetime of killing and suffering from this night onward. Because of this night, he will turn into a werewolf, hungry for blood, death, and destruction. His thirst will never be satiated. Dogs are the only animals able to detect this transformation in time. There is no cure for this. The only solution is to kill the child. Let us hope no parent ever has to make this sacrifice. The end. Thank you for choosing to spend some time with me listening to this tale. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give this channel a like, subscribe, and share with others. Until next time, take care.